Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. I'm very honoured to be here. Tempus Energy is an electricity supply business. We basically look at customers, look at what their needs are. Every customer has both flexible and inflexible needs, and by that I mean there are some things they need to do that are time critical and some that are not. An efficient energy system would push all the non-time critical needs into a lower price period as a first step, and as a second step would then push all those needs to match to renewables. And that's effectively what Tempus is trying to achieve. I recently saw the movie Suffragette. For those of you who haven't seen the movie opens up with all these quotes that happened at the time of the suffragette movement. All the people who didn't believe that universal suffrage was a positive thing. When we read some of these comments now, to most of us, they seem really dated. They haven't stood the test of time. And I think a lot of that is because what underpins these views is oppression of mankind against mankind. And history shows us repeatedly that holds for a certain period of time, and then the oppressed rise up and it's no longer possible. By very, very sharp contrast, if we look at some of the things that were said by the original architects of the electricity system, these quotes actually have stood the test of time. They could grace the wall of any innovation company today. They grace the wall of Tempus. And that's because they're about something universal that human beings hold true to. The spirit of innovation that started the original energy system had enormous positives for humanity. It created prosperity. It pulled people out of poverty. And mainly in the developed world, it changed the energy and lighting from a very harmful to human health into something that was no longer harmful to human health. So it had an enormous impact. And that spirit of innovation was business-led. There were people who thought that they could make money out of changing how things were being done, out of creating new technology to do things differently. When we think about climate change, I think we need a paradigm shift. In many ways, climate change is presented to us as this battle of man against nature. When we think of battles like that, we feel scared and hopeless because it's very hard for a small human to win in the battle against nature. But is that really what climate change is actually about? Or is it the battle of man against man? As this image quite clearly demonstrates, when there is a battle of man against man, we actually don't feel hopeless. We feel that if we find the strength inside, we actually can overcome our opponents. And I think the more we characterize climate change as something that human beings can put their intellect, creativity, and sheer hard work into to solve, the more we will create opportunities to actually solve climate change. In how Tempus looks at this, we look at climate change as an economic problem, so therefore it needs an economic solution. So we have analyzed the energy system from an economic perspective and thought about how you could actually make more money as an electricity supplier by doing things differently that actually don't cause climate change. When I pitch to an investor, and we're in the process of closing a £5 million investment round, so investors are very interested in this space. When I pitch to an investor, I barely mention climate change. I just talk to them about how we've innovated to a lower cost base, and therefore we can supply electricity to customers at a much lower cost. And you know what? Customers actually would like electricity at a much lower cost, it turns out. No customer is upset at getting a lower electricity bill. We have currently still a paradigm where we think about when there's a constraint in the energy system, we have to build more fossil fuel generation. That's the only way we can solve it. Last week's issues where we had a constraint on Wednesday and National Grid did have to take some action, produced a number of different articles in the media saying, no, customers forced to turn off, customers pressed to turn off, as though this is an appalling thing that's happening to Britain. Actually, those customers were not forced to turn off. They were not pressed to turn off. They saw the very clear economic opportunity to create a lower cost base for their organization that makes them more competitive. And that is the only reason why they turned off. They moved non-critical load to a lower price period, and they were paid to do so. That's a positive thing. That's what's going to make our energy system much, much more efficient. But we keep repeating this bad news story around not having enough generation. And this is why I asked the question earlier, because there is a holding on with the incumbents. And those incumbents, they use fear tactics to hold on. The lights are going to go out. Actually, if you look historically at when the lights go out, it is not caused by generation capacity constraints. It's caused by distribution network faults. But that is missed in the bad news media story, and it's a little bit too hard to explain to people. The real bad news story that is actually happening and should be reported on is how we are not taking the opportunity that is coming from climate change resolution. There are enormous business opportunities out of resolving climate change. Tempus is just one example. Every time we make a customer flexible by putting equipment in their premises, that's a business and service that can be exported to other countries that also would like to make the energy system more efficient because it makes economic sense to them. If we don't take advantage of being a front runner, we will be left behind. If we keep building generation from last century and before, we will be left behind. I was horrified recently when the DEC head of security of supply said openly that the presence of small-scale diesel generation in the capacity market is a sign of innovation. The first patent for a diesel generator was lodged in 1892. I don't think I need to say anything else on that subject. The opportunity to build businesses that resolve climate change is enormous. And those things, the things that make money, they will actually happen. They'll be implemented. They will become successful. And that's what Britain has an enormous opportunity to take advantage of. The key thing to build those businesses, I think, is the ability to say, stuff it, we're going to do something different. And I think that is deeply ingrained in the British psyche, and we should be actually taking advantage of that. Smart meters are the foundation of this new system because they give the data that you can use for settlement. Tempus, every single customer we have, we put a smart meter in. Why? Because we have to settle the customer against their actual consumption, so that when we move them from one period to another, we unlock the value for that so we can give it to the customer. I think the mandated rollout is going to be a transformative rollout for Britain, but there are some key things that we haven't quite got right yet. And one of those is actually using the data, settling the customers against their actual data. Now, I know Ofgem is doing enormous amounts of work in this area and really trying to push this. But this is an area where government could actually make a very cost-effective change. They would not need to put any investment in, to actually make this change, to say we must half-hourly settle every customer when they have a smart meter. That will unlock an enormous amount of innovation and will not cost the government a great deal of money. So I would really recommend that happens. And so, as I've said, smart meters, they are the foundations of this new energy system, this new smart energy system. So let's get on with building that foundation. Thank you very much.